What if Catelyn Stark was reborn, knowing she was wrong about Jon Snow? The gasp that pulled her from the darkness was not a gentle thing. It tore out of Catelyn Stark like a rope drawn suddenly taut, her whole body arching against the furs, her heart hammering with a violence that seemed determined to break itself against her ribs. For a long moment, she could not understand where she was, only that the cold at her throat was gone, that the terrible parting of her flesh had not happened, that the blood which had poured over her hands in that torchlit hall was nowhere to be found. She lay trembling in the dark, and the dark did not answer her. Then, slowly, the room resolved itself around her, the heavy timber of the ceiling above, blackened by years of hearth smoke, the narrow window with its wooden shutter, through which a pale gray northern light was only beginning to seep, the scent of the place, that particular mingling of wood smoke and old stone, and the faint green damp of the godswood beyond the walls, so familiar that it undid her more thoroughly than any strangeness could have. This was Winterfell. This was her own chamber, the one she had shared with Ned in the early years of their marriage, and she knew the shape of it, the way one knows the sound of one's own name. She lifted her hands before her face with a slow, dreading care, and in the thin light she saw them whole, unmarked. The fingers she remembered clawing at her own throat in the final horror of that other night were smooth and unbroken, the nails clean, no half-moons of dried blood beneath them. She turned them over and back again, and a sound came out of her that was neither weeping nor laughter, but something caught trembling between the two. Because she remembered. That was the cruelty and the gift of it, tangled together so tightly she could not pull them apart. She remembered all of it, every year and every grief, from this cold morning at the beginning of everything down to the last. She remembered a wedding, and music that had turned to slaughter, and the weight of her son's body, and her own voice rising into a shriek that no throat should ever have to make. She remembered dying, and now she lay in a bed she had not slept in for the better part of 20 years, and the light, coming through the shutter, was the light of a morning she had already lived once and thought lost forever. It was not a dream. She knew the texture of dreams, and this had none of it. The cold of the floor when at last she set her bare feet upon the boards was real, biting up through her soles with the honest bluntness of stone. The rough weave of the shift against her skin was real. The very ache in her neck, faint now and fading, seemed a memory the body itself refused to surrender. She stood in the gray half-light and pressed her palm flat against the wall, and the wall held her up, and she understood with a certainty that frightened her more than any doubt could have that she had been given her life to live again. And with the understanding came the other thing, the knowledge that had risen in her somewhere in the passage between death and this waking, in that space beyond the veil where all the small deceptions of the living are burned away. It settled into her now, as plain and heavy as a stone laid in her open hands. She knew the truth of the child. She knew that the infant sleeping even now in the nursery down the cold corridor, the babe she had spent the whole of her first life resenting as the proof of her husband's faithlessness, had never been Ned's son by another woman at all. He was Lyanna's boy, Lyanna Stark's, born in a tower in the south while the realm burned, the last living secret of a sister who had died, with a promise on her brother's lips. Ned had not betrayed her. Ned had carried a truth so dangerous that even the sharing of it with his wife might have meant a small boy's death, for Robert Baratheon would have crushed the last spark of the dragon's line without a moment's mercy, kin or no, and so her husband had let her believe the worst of him, and had borne her coldness in silence, and had guarded the child with a lie because a lie was the only shield he had. The weight of it bowed her where she stood. She thought of all the years that had not yet happened, but which she remembered as clearly as scars. She thought of the way she had never once looked at the boy without a flicker of resentment, never once spoken a kind word to him, never once let him forget by so much as a glance that he did not belong to her hearth. She thought of the day the sickness had come for her own Bran, and the prayers she had made in the dark, and the terrible bargain she had struck within herself, that if the gods would only spare her son, she would love the bastard, and how she had broken that vow the very moment her fear had passed. All of it lay before her now, waiting to be committed, none of it yet done. Her hands were clean, and she understood that this was the whole meaning of the second waking, that she had been returned to the one morning before the cruelty had truly begun, so that she might choose otherwise. She could not do it again. That much she knew before she knew anything else, before she had reasoned a single step toward what she would do instead. She could not walk back into that life and repeat the slow poisoning of her own house, could not let the coldness settle over the years like frost over stone until it had killed something in all of them. Whatever came, whatever it cost her pride, she would not be the woman she had been. She drew a long breath, and the cold air filled her, and she turned toward the door and the sleeping child beyond it, uncertain what she would say when she reached him, knowing only that she must go. The corridors of Winterfell were quiet in the gray hour before the household woke, and Catelyn moved through them as a woman half in dream, her bare feet finding the cold of the stone and taking it into her without complaint. She knew these passages, knew the turn where the draft came sharp from an ill-fitted shutter, knew the low arch that had never been built quite tall enough for a grown man to pass beneath without bowing his head, and yet everything wore the strangeness of a place returned to after long absence, familiar and unbearably fresh at once. The torches had guttered low in their brackets and shed a soft, uncertain light that pooled and faded along the walls. Somewhere far below, a door closed and a servant's tread began the day, but here in the upper reaches, all was hushed, and she came at last to the nursery where the child lay, and she paused with her hand upon the wood of the door and let herself be still. When she pushed it open, the small room received her with its own quiet warmth. A brazier burned low in the corner, and the air was gentler here than in the corridors, thick with the smell of milk and clean linen and the faint sweetness of a sleeping infant. 2 cradles stood near the hearth, and in the first, her own son lay with his fists curled beside his face, his breath coming in the small, even sighs of a child who has known nothing but safety. She looked at him only briefly, for she carried the memory of every year of his life already within her, and it was the other cradle that drew her, the one she had passed 1,000 times in that other life without once permitting herself to truly see what lay inside it. The bastard was awake. He did not cry, only lay with his dark eyes open to the shifting light, watching the ceiling with the grave and patient attention that infants sometimes wear, as though weighing matters far beyond their years. Catelyn crossed to him slowly and looked down, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, she looked without the venom that had curdled every glance she had ever given him. She saw a child. She saw the fine dark hair and the long stark face already forming in the soft round of his features, and beneath it, threaded through it, something else, something that was not Ned at all, a shape about the eyes and the set of the small mouth that belonged to a woman dead in a bed of blood far to the south. Lyanna's blood. She had never let herself see it, because seeing it had never served her rage. But now, unclouded, it was as plain to her as the grief that had lived behind her husband's silence for 16 years. She reached down and let the child close his tiny hand around her finger, and she felt the strength of that grip, the fierce animal wanting of a thing newly alive, and something in her that had been frozen a very long time began, quietly and without permission, to thaw. "You are not a shame," she said to him, so low the words scarcely stirred the air. "You are what he could not save of her, and I will not punish you for what he could not tell me." Behind her, the door had opened without her hearing it, and when she turned, Ned stood in the frame with the gray of the dawn behind him, and his face braced hard as a man who expects a blow. He had come, she understood, because word had reached him that she was here, and he had come the way a man goes to meet an enemy, ready to shield the boy from her tongue, ready to endure whatever cruelty she meant to lay upon the cradle. She saw all of it in the tight line of his jaw and the wariness in his eyes, and it grieved her that she had ever taught him to look at her so. "He will be raised in this house as your blood," she said. "I will not speak against it, not now, not ever." For a long moment Ned did not answer, and his silence was not the guarded silence she had known, but the silence of a man who cannot trust what he has heard. He searched her face for the trap in it, for the cold beneath the words, and finding none, he seemed almost to falter where he stood. "Cat," he said at last, and her name came from him roughly, as though it had cost him something. "You need not. I would not ask it of you. You have not asked it. I have chosen it." She looked back down at the child, who had not released her finger. "He is a babe, Ned. Whatever was done, he did none of it." She watched the doubt war with the relief in him, watched him fail to understand, and dare not question the mercy, for fear it would vanish if he pressed too hard upon its edges. He came into the room and stood beside her, and together they looked down at the boy, and for a space neither of them spoke. "His mother," Catelyn said softly, and she felt him stiffen at once, the old wall rising. "You have never spoken of her, not once." "No," Ned said, "and I will not. I do not ask you to name her." She kept her voice gentle, careful as a woman crossing thin ice above dark water, letting him hear no accusation, no hunger, only the quiet of a wife making peace. "I ask only whether she is a danger to him, whether there are those who would wish him harm for who she was." Ned turned to her then, and in his gray eyes she saw a flicker of alarm swiftly mastered, and in the swiftness of that mastering, in the way he chose his silence rather than his denial, she read the whole of the truth she already carried. He said nothing. He did not need to, and Catelyn, watching the fear move behind her husband's careful stillness, understood with a cold and certain clarity exactly how much the boy in the cradle would one day be worth killing for. The winter that followed was gentle as northern winters went, and the two boys grew through it side by side, cradled in the same warmth, fed from the same great fire that never wholly went out in the nursery beneath the great keep. Catelyn had given orders that the cradles be set close together, near enough that a nurse might reach from one to the other without rising, and she watched the servants obey with the faint puzzlement of those who did as they were bidden, and reserved their opinions for the kitchens and the wash-houses, where such opinions were freely traded. She saw the looks pass between them, the small, quick glances that carried whole conversations, and she let them pass without comment, for she knew that a lady who protested too loudly against gossip only fed it, and she had learned in her cradle years at River Run that authority was often a matter of what one chose not to notice. Robb was the larger of the two, broad even in infancy, with the auburn cast of his mother's hair already promising itself in the fine down upon his head, and Jon was the quieter, dark and watchful, with a stillness in him that seemed too old for so small a creature. When one wept, the other often woke, and Catelyn found that she could not always tell, in the first blur of a disturbed night, which of the two small voices had summoned her from sleep, and she came to both without distinction, gathering whichever child cried into her arms with the same murmured hush. She had thought this would be hard. She had braced herself for the harness of it, the daily labor of a will set against its own inclination, and she was surprised, in a way she did not speak of to anyone, to find how quickly the labor became habit, and how quickly the habit became something warmer than habit. At table, when the boys were old enough to be brought down among the household, she seated the dark child no lower than the true-born one, and she corrected any steward who tried to arrange it otherwise, doing so quietly, in passing, so that no ceremony attached to the correction, and no one might carry word southward that the Lady of Winterfell had made a scene over her husband's bastard. In the yard, where the boys tumbled and fought and learned to fall without weeping, she praised them both and scolded them both, and the master-at-arms, who watched over their first wooden swords, learned from her manner that the two were to be measured against one another, and neither favored, and he shaped his lessons accordingly. In the sept, on the days she went to pray to gods her husband did not keep, she took both children with her when they were small enough to be carried, and she taught them the same words. And if the old northern lords who came through Winterfell thought it strange that the Tully woman would kneel a bastard before the seven beside her own son, they said nothing to her face, and she gave them nothing to say. The talk, when it rose, she quelled with the small instruments of a great house, a word to the head cook whose loyalty she had cultivated with 100 small kindnesses, a coin pressed into the hand of a girl who might otherwise carry a tale to a traveling merchant, a look given to a steward that told him more surely than any command that certain subjects were closed. She did not threaten. Threats bred resentment, and resentment bred the very whispers she meant to silence, and so instead, she made herself so present, so warm, so plainly and openly devoted to raising the two boys as brothers, that the gossip found no purchase, for there is little to whisper about in a thing done plainly in the light. Winterfell's small folk, who had at first marked the lady's warmth toward the base-born child as a curiosity, came in time to see it as merely the way of things, and a thing that is merely the way of things is a thing that no one troubles to report. But the deepest change was not in the yard or the sept or the wash-houses. It was in the chamber she shared with her husband, in the hours after the candles were pinched out, when Ned came to her carrying the weight of the day and, increasingly, the weight of the years that stretched behind and before him. He had always been a man who kept his own counsel, who folded his fears inward and let no one see the folding, and Catelyn had married that silence and made her peace with it, believing it the price of a man raised in war and grief. Yet as the boys grew, and as she gave him, night after night, the plain evidence that she meant the child no harm, and asked him nothing he could not give, something in him began to loosen. He spoke to her of Robert, of the king's suspicions and the king's forgetfulness, of how a friendship might shield a secret for a while, and yet how kings did not stay their whole lives in one humor. He spoke of Jon Arryn, and of the Lannisters at court, and of the long memory of Dorne, and though he never named the thing they both circled, he let her see the shape of his dread, the outline of it beneath the cloth, and she took each confidence, and held it, and gave him back only calm, only the steadiness of a woman who would not flinch. Their marriage, which had begun as a bargain between two great houses, and grown into a fond and dutiful companionship, deepened in those years into something she had not expected and had ceased to hope for, a true partnership, welded not by love alone, but by a shared and unspoken burden that neither could set down and neither would carry without the other. And on a night late in that long winter, when the wind pressed hard against the shutters and the fire had burned to embers, Ned turned to her in the dark and said, very low, "There is a thing I have never told any living soul." And Catelyn lay still and waited and did not breathe. What Ned confided to her that night she carried afterward, like a stone laid gently into the deep places of her memory. And though the words themselves belonged to him and to their marriage, the burden they added to her own hidden knowledge pressed upon her a question she could no longer defer. She had returned to this life with a whole geography of tomorrows spread before her, every road and ruin of it known. And in the first months of that second living, she had imagined, in her private hours, that she might simply unmake the whole of it, that she might reach forward into the years and pluck out the disasters one by one as a gardener pulls weeds. But the more she turned the matter over in the long dark stretches when Ned slept beside her, the more she came to fear the tangled roots of every action, for she had learned once already how a single word spoken in anger, a single door left unbarred, could bring the world down in fire, and she did not know, she could not know, whether saving one life might not cost her 10 she had never thought to number. There was a particular terror in foreknowledge that no one who had not carried it could understand, the terror of the branching path, the dread that in reaching to prevent one grief she might summon a worse one she could not foresee because it had never yet come to pass. If she warned too loudly, if she moved too boldly against the currents of the age, she might only stir the waters and drown them all the sooner. And so, over the slow turning of a season, Catelyn made a resolution that steadied her more than any bold scheme could have, choosing to trust only in what she was certain of, to build her defenses only upon the ground she knew would hold. She was certain of her children. She was certain of Jon. She was certain that Winterfell must be strong, and its people fed, and its walls manned, when the cold and the wars came. And to these certainties she bent herself, letting the rest of the great terrible tapestry hang where it would. She began, then in ways so gentle that no one who watched her could have named them anything but a mother's ordinary care. She taught her sons caution as though it were a household virtue, sitting with Robb over the maps in the long gallery and speaking of how the South devoured northern men who trusted its smiles, how a lord who rode to a feast unarmed and unwary too often did not ride home. She spoke to Jon and Robb together, deliberately together, of the strength that lay in brothers who did not let others set them against one another, and she watched Jon's dark eyes lift to hers in a wary wonder each time she included him, as though he could not quite believe himself named among the household's hopes. She framed every lesson as the plain wisdom of a woman who had seen the world, never as prophecy, never as anything a listening ear might carry to the wrong quarter, and the boys absorbed it as children absorb the temper of their mother, half unknowing, so that caution and unity grew in them like the shape of their own bones. The maester's ravens came as they had always come, but now she read the world they carried with different eyes. When word arrived of Targaryen loyalists gathered in the free cities, of exiled lords who still drank to a dead dragon and dreamed of return, she felt beneath the parchment the first faint tremor of a quaking she remembered all too well, the distant groan of a great structure beginning, very slowly, to fail. Robert's rule, for all its feasting and its bluster, sat upon foundations she knew to be riddled through, held up by Jon Arryn's steady hand, and by the exhaustion of a realm too weary to rebel. And she understood, as few others in that hall could, that the peace they lived within was not a settled thing, but a held breath, a pause between two storms. So she made ready, quietly, patiently, in the manner of a woman putting her house in order against a hard winter that everyone agreed was coming, even if none could say precisely when. She spoke to the steward of the granaries and found reasons, always sensible reasons, why the stores should be greater than custom required, why the salt fish should be laid in deeper and the grain sealed against the damp with more care. She turned her mind to the alliances of the North, to the bannermen whose loyalty was the true wealth of Winterfell, and she encouraged Ned in his correspondence with the Manderleys and the Umbers and the Mormonts, praising the strength of old bonds until the tending of them became habit. She saw to it that the armory was inventoried and the smiths kept busy, that the young men trained not merely for sport, but with a seriousness she instilled by presence alone, and none of it drew remark. For what was a great lady but the keeper of her house? And what was a wise keeper but one who prepared? Yet there were nights when the weight of it all pressed so heavily that she could not sleep, when she lay listening to Ned's breathing and to the wind that never truly ceased in that ancient place, and she wondered whether the small, careful things she did would matter at all against the sheer momentum of what was coming. She thought of the boy sleeping in his narrow bed across the castle, the boy she had once hated and now guarded, and she thought of the promise she had made in the sept of her own heart, and she resolved anew to hold her course. And then, on a gray morning, when the frost lay white upon the courtyard stones, and her breath smoked in the chill air of the maester's turret, a raven came bearing the seal of the Eyrie, and when the old man broke it and read, his face changed in a way she had prayed she would not see so soon, and he looked up at her, and she felt the held breath of the realm begin, at last, to release. But that gray morning and its raven belonged to a season yet distant, a shadow glimpsed on the horizon rather than a storm broken overhead, and between the promise made and the reckoning that would come, there stretched a run of years soft with ordinary things. Winter came and went in its lesser cycles, and the boys who had wrestled as children in the straw of the stables grew tall and lean and quick, and the yard where they trained became the truest measure of what Catelyn's mercy had wrought. Sir Roderick Castle, master-at-arms of Winterfell, was a man of stiff whiskers and stiffer principles, and he had no patience for favor or for the fictions of rank when a boy stood before him with a blunted sword in his fist. In the yard, there were no bastards and no true-born sons, only those who kept their guard high and those who ate the dirt for forgetting to. And it was in the yard, more than anywhere else in that vast cold castle, that Jon Snow had become the equal of his brother. He and Robb circled one another across the frost-hard ground, while their breath hung in the still morning air, and the ring of their practice swords carried up the walls and set the ravens to grumbling in the rookery. They were matched so evenly that the watching guards could seldom name the victor before the last exchange, and there was in their contest none of the bitterness that so often soured such rivalries, only the clean pleasure of two young men who loved each other and delighted in testing the measure of that love against the edge of a blade. What the men who watched remarked upon most, though few of them could have said it in words, was the way Jon carried himself. There had been a time when he was small, when he stood always half in shadow, his shoulders drawn inward as if to make himself less, as if to apologize for the mere fact of his presence at a table or a hearth. That boy was gone. In his place stood a young man who met the eyes of the northern lords when they came to Winterfell, who spoke plainly and well, who bore his mother's absence and his uncertain name without the old flinching shame. The Umbers and the Glovers and the Karstarks, who rode through the gates on the business of the North, saw him at Robb's side, and marked how the Lady Stark herself would call him by name in the hall, would ask after his training, would set a place for him near her own children, and they drew their conclusions accordingly. A boy so kept was a boy who mattered, and the bannermen adjusted their courtesies to fit. It was Catelyn who had made it so, and the making of it had cost her more than the household knew. She remembered still the evening she had gone to Ned in his solar with the matter settled in her mind, when the fire had burned low and the wolf pelts lay heavy across the floor, and she had told him that she would not have Jon sent to the wall. He had looked at her with such astonishment that she had nearly faltered, for he had long carried the notion that the black would be the boy's honorable path, a place where a base-born son might rise on merit alone and trouble no one's inheritance. She had chosen her words with care, letting none of the desperation she felt bleed into them. "He is one of the finest young men in the north," she had said, "and you would send him to freeze on a wall at the edge of the world, to father no children and hold no lands, and swear away everything he might become. That is not honor, my lord. That is waste. A family entire is a strength, and a family that casts off its own to satisfy the tidy expectations of lesser men is a family that has begun to unravel from within." Ned had said nothing for a long while, only watched the fire, and she had seen in the set of his jaw the war between the vow he had made to someone unnamed and the wife who now, impossibly, argued for the boy she had once looked upon with such cold distaste. That she of all people should plead Jon's case had struck him more forcibly than any argument, and though he made her no promise that night, she saw that the seed was planted and that it had taken root in ground she had spent years preparing. Yet there remained the harder truth, the one that no amount of affection in the yard could dissolve. Jon was beloved, and Jon was respected, and Jon was still, in the eyes of every law that governed lords and lands, a bastard. He held no claim to Winterfell, no right to any holdfast or title, no name save the one the North gave to all its baseborn as a mark of their making. And Catelyn, who had once been content to let that stone wall stand between the boy and her own children, now found that she could not. Having chosen to love him, she discovered that love was not a thing that held its place. It grew, and reached, and demanded. It was not enough that he be fed and trained and honored within these walls. She wanted him made secure against a world that would strip such graces away the moment Ned's protection failed. So she had begun, quietly at first, and then less quietly, to speak of legitimacy, to murmur the word to Ned in the dark, to let the northern lords understand where her heart lay, to stake upon this cause the very reputation she had spent a lifetime building. It was a public reversal, and she knew it, knew that men who had once called her the proper Southern lady would now whisper that she had grown strange, that she championed a bastard as though he were her own blood. She let them whisper. She had made her choice, and she would see it through, and she had all but won Ned to it when the Raven came, though in truth, a greater truth about the boy's blood would soon make the question of a bastard's name seem small indeed from the Eyrie, and everything she had planned began, all at once, to slip beyond her reach. The Raven brought word of Jon Arryn's death, and Catelyn read the letter in the failing light of the solar with a stillness that unsettled the maester who had carried it to her. She knew what came next, as surely as she knew the shape of her own hands. The old hand of the king was dead, poisoned though few yet suspected it, and his death was the first stone dislodged from a slope that would carry everything she loved down into ruin. She had lived through this before. She had felt the news land against her heart like a blow the first time, and now it landed again, softer for being expected, and worse for the same reason, because she understood at last that expectation gave her no power to prevent it, only the terrible clarity to watch it come. The whole of Winterfell had turned itself over in the days that followed, scrubbed and swept and readied, for a king was on the road. Robert Baratheon was coming north, with half the court trailing behind him, with his golden queen and her golden children, with knights and wagons and the vast slow machinery of a royal progress that churned the king's road to mud beneath its wheels. Catelyn moved through the preparations with her old competence, ordering the kitchens and the guest chambers, seeing to linens and to wine, and all the while, a colder part of her stood apart and counted the hours as a physician might count the failing breaths of a patient already lost. She knew the shape of the coming day. She knew that Robert would embrace her husband in the yard, that he would demand to be taken to the crypts to stand before the stone likeness of a woman long dead, that he would offer Ned the handship as a gift and a burden both, never once suspecting that he offered him a death sentence dressed in the finest words of friendship. When the king came, it happened exactly as she remembered. The great fat man swung down from his horse and pulled Ned into his arms, with a laugh that shook the walls, and the children knelt in the cold mud in their good clothes, and the queen looked upon the north with eyes that found it wanting. Catelyn watched Cersei Lannister's face and knew the thoughts behind it, knew the secret that woman carried, knew what Jon Arryn had discovered and what it had cost him. She curtsied and smiled and said the words a lady of Winterfell was meant to say, and inside her, a voice was screaming at her husband to run, to bar the gates, to send this king and his poisoned court back down the road they had come. That night, when the feast had guttered down to its embers and the halls had emptied of song, she went to Ned in their chamber, and she did not soften what she had to say. She told him that he must refuse. She told him that King's Landing was a nest of vipers, coiled one within another, that every smiling face in that court was a mask over a knife, that the men who ruled there had murdered his friend and would murder him the moment he grew inconvenient. She spoke with a certainty that startled him, for she had never before pressed against his honor with such force, and she saw in his weathered face the confusion of a man who did not recognize the wife who stood before him, burning with foreknowledge she could not name. "Robert is my friend," he said, and the words were heavy with everything that friendship had ever meant to him, with the wars they had fought together, and the blood they had spilled, and the woman they had both loved and lost. "He asks me for help, Cat. How am I to look him in the eye and tell him no? The realm is in danger. Jon Arryn is dead, and Robert has no one else he trusts." She looked at him for a long moment, at the gray in his hair and the tired lines around his eyes, at the honor that would kill him worn upon him like a cloak he could not set aside, and she understood that she could not turn him. She had known she could not, in truth, before she ever entered the room. Ned Stark was made of duty, as the walls of Winterfell were made of stone, and a man could not be argued out of the substance of himself. So she changed her aim, as a woman throwing her body against a flood might abandon the hope of stopping it and turn instead to saving what she could carry. "Then take Jon, and take 20 of your own sworn men, and trust no sword you did not bring north with you," she said, and the words fell into the quiet of the chamber and lay there between them, strange and unlooked for. Ned turned to her with an astonishment so complete that he could not immediately speak, for of all the things his wife might have asked of him, this was the last he had ever expected to hear pass her lips. "Not to the wall," she went on, before he could gather himself. "Not to be buried alive and black and cold and forgotten. Take him south as your sworn man, your shield, your blood at your side. He is nearly grown, and he is the best of the boys with a blade. And you go into a den of enemies with no one at your back you can trust. Do not scatter this family, Ned. Do not send your daughters south and your son to the wall and leave the rest of us waiting behind these walls to learn by Raven what has become of you all. Keep him close. Keep him where his sword can guard your life." He stared at her as though she had become someone he had never met, and perhaps she had, and in his eyes she saw the old grief stir, the guilt he had carried for a lifetime, and beneath it, a dawning, unwilling hope that she had somehow reached across all the years of her coldness and offered him the one thing he had never dared to ask. He did not answer at once. He turned toward the fire, and his shoulders bowed under the weight of it, and Catelyn stood in the flickering dark and waited to learn whether she had changed the world. The days that followed carried a strange doubled quality for Catelyn, for she moved through hours she had lived once before, and yet found them altered by the smallest of her own choosings, and nowhere did this weigh upon her more heavily than in the matter of her second son. She knew the shape of what was coming. She knew that Bran, who loved nothing in the world so much as the high places, the rooftops and the gargoyles, and the crumbling towers where no grown man could follow, would climb where he ought not to climb, and that in doing so, he would see a thing that would nearly cost him his life. She could not unmake the boy's nature, for it was as fixed and bright as the northern stars, and to forbid him the climbing outright would only have driven him to it in secret. So she had done the only thing she could. She had walked with him one gray morning to the foot of the broken tower, the one the small folk called the First Keep, and she had spoken to him plainly of its dangers, of the loose stones and the rotted mortar, and the crumbling ledges that had killed men before, and she had asked him, not as a command, but as a mother asking her child for a gift, to stay away from that one place above all others. He had listened with those solemn eyes of his, and he had promised, and she had known even as he promised, that a boy's promise against the pull of a forbidden height was a fragile thing. Yet she had planted the warning where it might take root, and she had done more besides, for she had let it be known quietly among the guards that the broken tower was to be watched, and she had kept her own eyes upon her son with a vigilance that must have seemed to him and to all the household like the ordinary fretting of a mother who did not wish her children to break their necks. When the royal party came, with all its noise and glitter, and the queen's cold golden beauty, and the king's great booming laughter, Catelyn felt the old dread coil in her belly, like a serpent waking. She knew that in the chaos of the visit, in the hours when the whole castle turned its attention to feasting kings and wandering princes, a small boy might slip away unwatched. So she did not let him slip. She kept Bran near her through those crowded days, found small tasks for him, walked with him, asked him to sit at her side, and though he chafed at the closeness with the restlessness of any boy of 7, he stayed. And so it was that when the moment came, the moment she had dreaded across all the long years of her second life, she was not in some distant chamber tending a sick child while disaster unfolded beyond her reach. She was in the yard below the First Keep when Bran, in a heedless instant while a serving girl called her attention away, broke free and made for the tower after all, drawn by the same secret pull that had always drawn him. She saw him climbing. She cried out, and her voice carried up the gray stones, and perhaps it was that cry that saved him, for it startled the boy in the very instant that his eye caught what he was never meant to see through that high window, the queen and her brother twined together in their golden sin. Bran's hand slipped. Catelyn's heart stopped in her chest. But she was already moving, already shouting for the guards she had posted, and though she could not catch him, Though he fell as he had fallen before, this time there were men beneath, and hay had been piled by her order against the tower's base in the guise of ordinary stabling, and the fall that should have broken him utterly instead broke only his legs and left him living, senseless but breathing, his small chest rising and falling as she gathered him into her arms and wept. The days of his sleeping were a torment she had endured once, and now endured again. But this time, she did not keep her vigil alone and unguarded. She remembered too well the night the murderer came, the man with the fire and the Valyrian steel, and she remembered the scars she had carried ever after upon her hands where she had seized the blade. So this time she posted a guard within the sick room itself, a steady man of the household whom she trusted, and she kept her own watch beside him. And when the fires broke out in the stables as they had before, and drew every other soul in the castle away to fight the blaze, she did not send her women running. She waited. She waited with a dirk of her own beneath the blanket across her knees, and a guardsman standing in the shadows behind the door. The cat's paw came, as she had known he would, sliding through the door with the long dagger, and she meant to wring from him the name of the hand that had armed him. He did not reach the bed. The guardsman took him from behind, while Catelyn rose with her own blade bared. And though the man fought and cursed and slashed once at the air, he was borne down onto the stone floor and pinned there living, his precious dagger kicked spinning into the far corner, his breath coming ragged as the truth of his failure settled over him. She stood above him with her heart hammering, and she looked at the ruin of the plan she had once let slip through her fingers, the murderer she had once been forced to kill in desperation, now caught and breathing and able to speak. And as the guards bound his wrists and hauled him toward the black cells beneath the castle, Catelyn understood that she held in her grasp something she had never held before, not merely her own survival, but a living tongue whose confession she would keep sealed and ready, a witness to lay before the realm when the moment came to unmake a false king, and to the golden hand that had paid for a child's death. And she resolved that this time she would not follow that thread blindly into the dark. The road south had always been the place where everything had gone wrong the first time, and Catelyn knew it now as she knew the lines of her own hands. In the life she remembered, she had come down from the high seat of Winterfell in disguise, driven by fear and by a wounded heart, and she had ridden to King's Landing to lay the cat's paw's dagger before Petyr Baelish, and to trust the one man in all the 7 kingdoms she should never have trusted at all. She had learned nothing but lies dressed as friendship, and she had turned north again carrying those lies in her breast like embers. And when chance had thrown Tyrion Lannister across her path at the Crossroads Inn, she had let those embers catch. She had risen among startled travelers and named him her prisoner, and with a handful of hasty words, she had set the realm alight. Every ruin that followed, every death, and every burning field had traced its lineage back to that single unguarded moment when her grief had spoken louder than her reason. This time, she did not go south at all. She sat instead in the solar of Winterfell, with the fire crackling low and the shutters drawn against the autumn wind, and she wrote. She wrote with a slow and deliberate hand, choosing each word as a woman chooses stones to cross a river, testing the weight of them before she committed her balance. She did not name Baelish as a friend, for she no longer believed he was one. She did not entrust the tale to a raven, for ravens could be intercepted and read by clever fingers in distant rookeries. Instead, she summoned to her one of Ned's oldest and most silent men, a rider who had served the Starks since before her marriage, and who had never in all his years let a secret slip past his teeth. And she gave into his keeping a letter sealed thrice over with the dire wolf of her husband's house. What she wrote to Ned was not the frantic warning of a frightened wife, but the measured counsel of someone who had already watched the future burn. She told him that the queen's children were not the king's, that the truth of their parentage was a blade poised above the throne, and that the moment such knowledge became known, the Lannisters would kill to bury it. She told him to trust no offer of gold cloaks pledged to his cause, to keep his own counsel close, and above all to make ready to send Sansa and Arya out of the city before the trap closed around them. She did not explain how she knew these things, for there was no explaining a life already lived, and she trusted that her husband, who had loved her long, would read the certainty in her steady hand and believe. Far to the south, in a city where the sun fell warm and treacherous upon marble that hid 1,000 hungers, Ned Stark received that letter and read it 3 times in the privacy of the Tower of the Hand. The stone beneath his boots was cool even in the heat of the day, and the light came slanting through the narrow windows in bars of gold, and he sat for a long while with the parchment in his hands and his brow drawn down in thought. He was a man slow to suspicion and slower still to cunning, and this had been his undoing in another life he could not remember, for he had walked into King's Landing believing that honor answered honor and that a truth spoken plainly would be honored plainly in turn. But Catelyn's words settled into him like cold water into dry ground, and something in their certainty made him cautious in a way he had never before allowed himself to be. He did not confront the queen. He did not go to Littlefinger for whispered aid, nor did he lean upon Varys and his birds. He gathered instead the few men he trusted wholly, and he counted them on the fingers of one hand, and he found among them one he had almost overlooked. Jon Snow had come south at his father's side rather than to the wall, for Ned had heeded his wife's plea and brought the boy as his sworn shield, torn between the black and the world he had not quite left behind. He stood now in the Tower of the Hand as a young man grown lean and watchful, his dark hair falling loose about a face that was more stark than any of his true-born kin, and he carried himself with the quiet steadiness of one who had never expected the world to be kind, and so was never surprised by its cruelty. Ned looked at him across the shadowed room and saw, perhaps for the first time with clear eyes, not the living reminder of an old shame, but a sword he could depend upon in a city full of men who would sell their oaths for coin. "I need a man at my back who will not be bought," Ned said, and his voice was low, and the words carried a weight he did not often let others see. "Every knight in this city serves 2 masters, and I cannot tell which of them will draw when the moment comes. But you, I think, serve only one." Jon met his father's gaze without flinching. "I serve you," he said simply, "whatever comes." And it was strange, Ned thought, how the presence of that one loyal blade changed the shape of everything before him. He had felt himself alone in a nest of vipers, hemmed in by smiling faces and gilded lies, and now he felt the small solidity of a single trustworthy sword and understood how much a single point of steadiness could alter the balance of a falling world. He gave orders that night, quiet and careful orders, that a ship be sought and held ready in the harbor, and that his daughter's septa be told to pack such things as travelers pack, and that no word of any of it should reach beyond the walls of that high tower. The trap was still there, coiled and waiting in the marble and the gold, but for the first time, the hand of the king moved to slip its jaws before they closed. The great tomes of the realm's lineage lay open before Ned in the dim library where old Grand Maester Pycelle kept his dusty archive, and by the light of a single guttering candle, he traced the lines of hair and eye and bone that spooled backward through the generations of House Baratheon. Every Baratheon who had ever wed a Lannister had gotten black-haired children, without exception, the ink-dark strands overwhelming the pale gold as surely as night overtook the dusk. And Ned read the truth in those crabbed letters, the way another man might read a death warrant. Joffrey was fair. Myrcella was fair. Tommen was fair. All of them gold as their mother, none of them carrying the black of the man they called father, and the meaning of it settled into Ned's chest like a stone dropped into still water, spreading rings of terrible understanding outward until the whole of it lay clear before him. In the history that Catelyn alone remembered, this was the moment that had doomed her husband, for he had carried his newfound knowledge to the queen herself, out of some misguided sense of honor, warning Cersei to flee before the king could learn of her betrayal, and that warning had given her the days she needed to arrange his ruin. But Catelyn's letters had reached him weeks before, letters that spoke of Petyr Baelish with a coldness she had never shown any man, letters that named the Master of Coin a liar who wore friendship as a mummer wore a painted face. And those warnings had lodged in Ned's mind like burrs and would not be dislodged. So when Littlefinger came to him in the gardens with his easy smile and his soft counsel, murmuring that the City Watch could be bought, that gold could purchase loyalty enough to seize the throne, Ned listened with a stillness that gave nothing away and trusted none of it. He did not go to Cersei. He did not breathe a word of what he had found to any soul save Jon, who stood at his door each night with a bared blade across his knees, and to a handful of northern men whose loyalty had been forged in the long cold of Winterfell and could not be bought at any price. Instead, Ned moved as a man moves through a house he knows to be on fire, quietly and quickly, gathering what he needed and preparing his escape. He had copies made of the relevant pages, sealed them, and entrusted them to a rider bound for the Vale and another bound for Dragonstone, where Stannis Baratheon kept his grim court, so that the truth would not perish with him should the worst come to pass. And each evening he watched his daughters at their small suppers, Sansa dreaming still of golden princes, and Arya restless as a caged wolf, and he felt the weight of what he was about to ask of them, that they leave this city of marble, and lies before it swallowed them whole. The days grew hot and heavy, thick with the scent of the harbor and the rot beneath the gilding, and word came at last that the king had ridden out to hunt. Robert Baratheon, who had grown vast and slow with wine and years, went into the Kingswood after boar with his belly full of strong wine, and there, among the green shadows and the humming flies, the great tusked beast opened him from groin to breast before the spears could bring it down. They carried him back to the Red Keep on a litter, the life leaking out of him with every jolt of the road, and by the time he lay upon his bed, the sheets beneath him were sodden dark, and the smell of death hung in the chamber like incense. Ned came to his old friend's side and knelt upon the cold stone, taking the great ruined hand in both his own, and Robert asked him, in a voice gone thin and rattling, to write down his final words. In the history Catelyn remembered, Ned had written that the regency should pass to his rightful heir, and had meant Stannis by it, and that small mercy of omission had cost him everything. But this Ned, hardened by foreknowledge he did not fully understand, wrote the words plainly and kept the parchment close against his breast when it was done, sealed and hidden, telling no one what it contained. He did not linger to grieve, as long as his heart demanded, for grief was a luxury the moment did not permit, and he rose from the deathbed with his mind already racing ahead to the hours that would follow. The moment Robert's breath ceased, the trap in the marble began to close, and Ned felt the change in the very air of the keep, the servants moving too quickly, the Lannister guardsmen thickening at the gates like clotting blood. Cersei would move now to seize the crown for her golden bastard, and she would reach first for anything that could be turned into a chain about Ned's throat, and that meant his daughters. So even as the bells began to toll for the dead king across the 7 hills of the city, Ned sent Jory Castle and 2 others down the servants' stair to fetch Sansa and Arya, and he sent Jon ahead of them with a purse of silver to the harbor where the ship lay waiting on the tide. Sansa wept and did not understand, clinging to the dream of the prince she was promised to, and it took all of Ned's stern gentleness to make her go, while Arya went silent and grim with a small blade hidden in her sleeve and her eyes darting like a hunting hawk's. The septa gathered them beneath dark cloaks, and Jon led them down through the winding underways beneath the keep, through passages that smelled of damp stone and old torches, his hand never far from the hilt at his hip. And above them, in the great gilded hall, where a throne of melted swords waited cold and empty, Cersei Lannister was already summoning her brother's men and demanding to know where the hand of the king had gone. The queen's rage moved through the Red Keep like a cold wind, and by the time her summons had reached the barracks and the guardhouse and the quiet corners where sworn swords waited on the pleasure of the crown, Ned Stark was no longer where she expected to find him. He had learned much in the long weeks since he had come to this city of stone and secrets, and though grief for his old friend Robert weighed on him like a shroud, he had not let that grief make him careless. There had been a letter tucked against his breast, sealed and unread, that named him protector of the realm, and once he might have trusted in that parchment the way a drowning man trusts a rope. Now he trusted only in the men he had brought south with him, in the good gray steel at his side, and in the passages beneath his feet that led away from the throne he had never wanted. The throne room, when the queen's men came for him at last, was not the place of his undoing. He met them instead in the outer yard near the stables, where the torchlight fell in long amber bars across the frost-slicked cobbles, and he was not alone. A dozen Stark guardsmen stood at his back in gray and white, their faces hard and their spears leveled, and at his right hand stood the boy, who was not truly his son, but who had ridden into every danger beside him as though he were. Jon had returned from the harbor road with the horses saddled and the way marked, and when the gold cloaks came pouring through the gate with drawn steel, it was Jon who called the first warning, his voice ringing clear across the cold air, and it was Jon whose blade rose to meet the first man who lunged toward Ned's unguarded side. What followed was not a battle in the manner the songs would later pretend, but a brief and brutal scramble in the dark, a thing of grunts and steel, and the wet sounds men make when they are hurt. Ned had planned for treachery, and so treachery, when it came, found fewer of its teeth already sunk into his flesh. Littlefinger had promised the gold cloaks, and the gold cloaks came, but they came in numbers that spoke of a man hedging his wager, holding some portion of his strength in reserve against the chance that the day might yet turn another way. Petyr Baelish had ever been a creature who wagered on every horse in the race, and that habit, which had made him rich, now spared the life of the man he had meant to see undone. Where once the trap had closed like a fist, this time it closed like a hand not quite committed to the grasp, and through the gap that half-heartedness left, the wolves of the north fought their way free. Ned did not escape unmarked. A gold cloak's blade found his thigh in the crush near the stable door, and the pain of it drove a grunt from between his teeth and set his leg to trembling beneath him, so that Jon and one of the guardsmen had to bear him up between them and half carry him to the waiting horse. Blood ran hot down into his boot and cooled there, and the wound would trouble him for many a mile. But a wound was a thing a man could live with, and living was more than the North had once been granted him. The great gray stallion took his weight, and Jon swung up behind another mount, and the small band of survivors spurred hard for the postern gate that the bribed guards there had left unbarred, riding out into the tangled streets of the city while the bells still tolled and the Queen's fury spread like fire through the halls behind them. Down through Flea Bottom they rode, through the reek of cookpots and tanneries and the press of common folk who scattered before the hooves and stared after them with wide and frightened eyes, and word ran ahead of them faster than any horse, the way word always does in a city too large to keep its secrets. There were whispers already, seeded in the days before by careful tongues and careless ones alike, whispers that the golden children of the Queen were not the get of Robert's loins at all, that the true blood of the stag ran only in his base-born bastards, and that the boy Joffrey, who would sit the Iron Throne, had no more right to it than any pretender. Ned had spoken too freely of what he had discovered, and the Queen had struck too openly, and now the two halves of a dangerous truth were rushing together in the taverns and the marketplaces where the small folk gathered, and no royal decree could gather them back into silence. At the harbor, the tide was turning, and the ship they had bargained for strained against her moorings with her sails half loosed, and there upon her deck stood two small figures wrapped in dark cloaks, one of them weeping still, and one of them standing grim and silent, with her hand pressed to something hidden in her sleeve. Sansa saw her father borne up the gangplank with blood upon his leg, and the Septas steadying arms around her, and she cried out at the sight, all her dreams of a golden prince curdling in that moment into something colder and more true. Arya said nothing at all, but her eyes went hard and bright, and she reached out to grip her father's hand as he was laid upon the boards, holding it as though she might keep him in the world by the strength of her small fingers alone. The ropes came free, and the ship swung out upon the dark water, with the lights of the city falling away behind her, and somewhere in the Red Keep, a queen was learning that the man she had meant to break was gone from her reach, wounded and fleeing, but breathing still, and carrying north with him the truth that would unmake her son's crown before it was ever firmly set upon his brow. The journey north was slow and perilous, hugging the coast where the ship might slip unseen past the eyes of the crown, and through those long gray days, Ned Stark lay in the small cabin with his wounded leg bound and elevated, drifting in and out of a fevered sleep, while the maester who had come aboard at the last moment tended the seeping flesh and murmured of poultices and of luck. He had not expected to live. He had gone to King's Landing certain of one thing above all others, that honor was the road a man walked, even when it led him into the dark, and he had walked it faithfully into a dungeon and very nearly onto a scaffold, and only the strange mercy of a wife, who seemed to know things she could not possibly know, had wrenched him free before the axe could fall. Now he lay listening to the creak of timbers and the slap of cold water against the hull, and when he woke to find Arya curled against his side, like a small fierce animal that would not be moved, he understood that whatever came next, he had been given a gift that few men in his position were ever granted, which was the chance to see the consequences of his choices and to choose again. When at last the ship came into White Harbor and Lord Manderley's men bore Ned up from the docks, with all the careful reverence due a living lord, rather than the cold ceremony owed a corpse, word ran ahead of them like fire through dry grass, and the North woke to a truth it had not dared to hope for. Ned Stark was alive. The Warden of the North had been betrayed and imprisoned and marked for death by the Lannisters who had seized the boy king's ear, and he had come home wounded but breathing, and the outrage that had smoldered in every northern hall now caught and blazed into open flame. Robb rode to meet them at White Harbor with a host already gathering at his back, And when he came into the hall where his father sat propped in a great chair with his legs splinted before him, the young man who crossed that floor was no longer the boy who had ruled Winterfell in his father's absence, but something harder and taller, a lord in his own right, who had learned the weight of command in the weeks of not knowing whether his father lived or died. Catelyn watched the two of them embrace, and she felt the full strange terror and wonder of what she had done, for she alone, among all the living, remembered another version of this, a version in which no ship had come and no father had returned, in which a boy had been crowned king in his grief and marched south to die with his throat opened at a wedding feast because he had trusted the wrong men and broken the wrong vows. She would not let that happen. She had come back from the cold place beyond death, carrying that knowledge like a coal held in the bare palm, and she meant to spend it wisely. In the councils that followed, she took her place at Robb's side, and where once she might have deferred to the men and their maps and their talk of lances and provisions, now she spoke, and Robb listened, because he had learned in the terrible weeks of her absence to trust the shape of her judgment. When Lord Roose Bolton offered his cold counsel, she marked the flatness of his eyes and steered her son gently but firmly toward keeping that man where he could be watched rather than where he could be trusted. When the question came of how the host would cross the twins and treat with old Walder Frey, she set her hand upon Robb's arm and told him plainly that no promise of marriage was to be made to that house. None. Not for a bridge, not for a crown, not for the whole of the Riverlands. And though Robb frowned and asked her reasons, she gave him only the certainty in her voice and the memory she could not share, and he yielded to it because he had never known his mother to speak so. "We will pay for the crossing in coin and in courtesy," she told him, "and we will bind ourselves to Lord Frey with words of thanks and nothing more. A man who sells a bridge will sell the men who cross it. Owe him no daughter, no son, no oath that cannot be unmade with silver." There was in this war a thing that had not existed in the other, and that thing was legitimacy. For a rebellion led by a grieving son, avenging a murdered father, was one matter, and a rebellion led by that son alongside the living, wronged, unjustly imprisoned Warden of the North was another matter entirely. Lords who had hesitated came now with their banners unfurled, because to ride with Eddard Stark was not to ride against the throne, but to ride against the usurping viper who had tried to murder the king's own hand. The cause wore the face of justice rather than the face of sorrow, and men followed justice more gladly than they followed grief. So the northern host marched south with 2 Starks at its head, though Catelyn knew well that half the realm still expected the doomed war she alone remembered, and she meant to give them a different one entirely. And behind them, the great gates of Moat Cailin stood open, and the trumpets rang across the neck, and Catelyn rode among them with her secret held close, and her eyes upon every man who came to swear his sword. She had unmade one doom. She did not yet know how many others waited coiled in the road ahead. And as the column wound down into the Riverlands beneath a sky the color of old iron, she found her thoughts turning north instead of south, north to the wall and to the boy in black she had wronged so grievously in that other life, the boy whose true birth she knew she must soon urge her husband to reveal, and she knew that soon, very soon, she would have to. The word came in the days that followed, carried by a rider whose horse was near foundering beneath him, that the boy in black would not remain at the wall much longer, for the letters Catelyn had sent north had done their quiet work, and the maester at Castle Black had counseled the Lord Commander that a man of Jon Snow's blood might be needed at his family's side in the days to come. Whether any of them understood the true weight of those words, she could not say, but the wheels she had set turning could not now be stopped. And so it was that on a gray evening, when the host had made its camp along the muddy banks of the Green Fork, Catelyn came at last to her husband's tent with the thing she had carried through 2 lifetimes pressing upon her tongue. Ned sat by a brazier whose coals cast a wavering amber light across the canvas walls, and he looked up at her entrance with the weariness of a man who had been fighting a war within himself long before any battle joined outside. She sat upon the edge of the cot beside him and took his hand, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, and the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant murmur of the camp settling into night beyond the tent. "You must tell them," she said at last, and her voice was gentle, but it did not waver. "You must tell Robb, and you must tell Jon. The secret you have kept has protected him well enough in peace, but there is no peace now, and a hidden thing has a way of surfacing at the worst of all possible moments. Better it come from your lips than from an enemy's." Ned turned to look at her, and something in his eyes flickered, a startlement that she should speak so plainly of a thing he believed he had buried past all finding. "You know," he said, and it was not a question, but a slow, wondering acknowledgement, as though a weight he had borne alone for 15 years had suddenly grown lighter for being shared, even as it grew more perilous for being spoken. "I know," she answered, and she pressed his hand between both of hers. "I have known longer than you can imagine, and I have made my peace with it, and I have made my peace with him. Whatever wrongs lie behind us, they need not follow us into what comes next. But he deserves the truth, Ned. He deserves to know who he is." They sent for Robb first, and then for Jon, and when the 2 young men entered the tent together, there was between them the easy warmth of brothers who had grown up shoulder to shoulder, sharing the same lessons and the same bruises and the same long nights of childhood in the cold halls of Winterfell. Ghost padded in at Jon's heel, silent as the snow for which he was named, the greatest of the 6 pups the boys had found beside their dead dam that first spring, 1 wolf for each Stark child and 1 for Jon, and settled himself against the far wall with his red eyes gleaming in the firelight. And Catelyn found that the sight of that white beast no longer stirred in her the old unease it once had, but something nearer to comfort. Ned bade them sit, and he was a long time finding his words, and when they came haltingly, dredged up from a depth of grief and love and old promises that he had never once let anyone glimpse. He told them of Lyanna, his sister, the wild wolf girl whose laughter still haunted him, and of the tower in the mountains of Dorne, where he had found her in a bed of blood, and of the promise he had made her as the life ran out of her, the promise he had kept through 15 winters of silence and shame that was never truly his to bear. And then he spoke the name, and it fell into the quiet of the tent like a stone into still water, spreading rings that would never cease. Jon did not move. He sat very still, his dark eyes fixed upon his father, and the color drained slowly from his face as the meaning settled into him, as the whole architecture of who he had believed himself to be shifted and reformed upon a new and stranger foundation. He was not the son of Ned Stark's dishonor. He was the son of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen, born perhaps of a marriage that had been lawful, a child of 2 great houses, dragon and wolf entwined in his blood, and the shame that had shadowed his whole life had been a lie told to keep him breathing. "You are still my brother," Robb said into the silence, and his voice cracked with the force of it, and he reached across and gripped Jon's shoulder as though to hold him fast against the tide of revelation that threatened to sweep him away. "Whatever else this makes you, it does not unmake that. It cannot." And it was then that Catelyn rose, and came to stand before the boy she had once refused to love, and she looked upon him now with clear eyes and an open heart. "Robb speaks true," she said, and her voice was steady and warm as banked coals. "Blood is only one thread of what a man is woven from. You were raised in Winterfell, you learned its ways, you knelt in its godswood and slept beneath its roofs and grew tall in its keeping, and that beast at your side found you and no other. Ghost chose you because you are a Stark in every way that matters, whatever name a dead prince gave you. Do not let this truth divide us, for it need not. Let it bind us instead." Jon looked up at her then, and in his eyes there was such astonishment, such raw and unguarded need, that Catelyn felt the last of the old bitterness dissolve within her like frost beneath a morning sun. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, and outside the tent the trumpets sounded the change of the watch, and far to the south the fires of a scattered army waited in the dark for the reckoning that neither peace nor secret could any longer forestall. The war that followed bore little resemblance to the one that fate had once decreed, for the pieces had shifted, and yet Catelyn found her mind returning always to the boy she had wronged, for it was the reckoning with Jon, not the war, that she had truly been sent back to face. And the reason for that shifting was a woman who now moved through the counsels of her son with a quiet certainty that others took for wisdom and could not know for memory. Word had reached the north that Robert Baratheon was dead, thrown from his horse, or gored by a boar, or poisoned by whatever hand had guided the wine. And in the old telling, this news had come tangled with the death of a father, and the captivity of daughters, and the frantic, wounded blindness of a house that struck out in grief without a plan. But Ned Stark still lived, having quit King's Landing with his household intact before the trap could close, and so the North did not stumble into war as a beast maddened by pain. It marched into war as a house that knew precisely what it wanted and precisely whom it could not trust. Catelyn understood, as few others could, that the great weakness of the coming years lay not in the strength of the Lannisters, but in the fracturing of those arrayed against them, the way 5 men had each reached for a crown, and in reaching had let the true enemy slip between their grasping fingers. She would not permit that fracturing to happen again. In the long nights of the ride south, she had spoken with Ned and with Robb of the man Stannis Baratheon, that hard and joyless brother of the dead king, whose claim was the rightful one by every law of blood and inheritance, and she had argued that whatever grievances the North held against the stiff-necked Lord of Dragonstone, an early pact with him would be worth 10 victories won alone. Ned had heard the sense in it, for Ned had always known that Stannis was the elder and the lawful heir, and it had grieved his honest heart to keep silent so long. So the ravens flew, and the words that passed between Winterfell's host and Dragonstone's fleet were not the wary circling of rivals, but the plain speech of allies who had chosen each other before ambition could set them at odds. Renly proved the harder matter, for Renly was young and beloved and had gathered to himself the great strength of the Reach and the Stormlands, and men who wear crowns of their own devising are seldom eager to set them down. Yet even Renly, faced with a united Northbound firmly to his elder brother, found the path to kingship narrower than he had supposed. There were no Stark envoys arriving in disarray, no house broken and desperate for any ally at any price. Instead, there came a measured proposal, carried by men who spoke with the weight of a whole realm behind them, and the proposal was this: that Renly might keep his lands and his lordship and a place of the highest honor in the councils of the realm, but that the crown belonged by right to Stannis, and that the North would treat with the brother who broke this truth as an enemy. Loras Tyrell bristled at the terms, and the Queen of Thorns weighed them with narrowed eyes. But Renly, who was not a fool whatever his vanity, understood that a coalition which did not devour itself might actually depose the golden bastard sitting the Iron Throne, and that a living lord in a victorious cause was a finer thing than a dead king in a divided one. He came to the table. It cost him pride, and it cost him dreams. But he came, and the five-sided war that had once soaked the earth of Westeros in the blood of a generation collapsed into two sides only, and one of them was very much stronger than the other. Robb won his early battles, as he had won them in the first history, for he had always possessed the gift of command that runs in the old wolf blood. But this time, his mother rode with knowledge that no spy could have furnished, and when scouts brought word of the disposition of Lannister forces, she could steer her son away from the ambush that waited in a certain wood, could name the ford where the enemy meant to make a stand, could whisper which lordly promise carried the taste of treachery beneath its sweetness. The Freys came to the Stark host with their customary bristling pride, and Walder Frey's kin were welcomed with every courtesy and watched with every suspicion. For Catelyn had not forgotten a hall gone red with the slaughter of men who trusted a host's bread and salt. No oath of marriage bound the North to that grasping house upon terms it could later betray. The Boltons, too, were kept close, and Roose Bolton, that pale and silent lord whose eyes gave nothing away, found himself given commands that never left him unwatched, his movements shadowed, his counsel heard and weighed, and quietly checked against other tongues. He noticed the watching, as such a man would notice everything, and he said nothing, and he waited, and Catelyn watched him wait. Far to the south, in the great walled city that stank of sewage and secrets, Tywin Lannister received the tidings of a North that would not break and a coalition that would not fracture. And for the first time in the long game of his life, the Lord of Casterly Rock found himself compelled to defend rather than to strike. His son had committed armies to the field, only to find the North would not break where it once might have. His allies wavered as the balance of the realm tilted against them, and the boy king upon the throne grew crueler and more reckless by the day, a liability that even gold could not gild. Tywin's cold mind turned and turned, seeking the flaw in the enemy's design, seeking the seam he might pry open, and finding fewer than he had ever found before. And in his private chambers, by the light of a single guttering candle, he summoned his most trusted man and spoke a name into the darkness, a name that would need to travel north by roads no honest messenger would ride. The name that Tywin Lannister spoke into the candle's failing light was one that Catelyn Stark had long dreaded, for she remembered where such whispers led, remembered the leech and the flaying knife and the smiling flatness of a face that betrayed nothing because there was nothing kind behind it to betray. Roose Bolton, Lord of the Dreadfort, master of that grim ancestral seat where floors were said to weep and the deep dungeons had heard sounds that no stone should have to remember, had once worn the trust of the Starks like a borrowed cloak and had shrugged it off precisely when it profited him most. She knew this. She carried the knowledge of it in her bones, the way an old wound carries the memory of the blade, and she resolved that this time the wound would not be permitted to open. She came to Robb and to Ned together, in the quiet hour before the war councils gathered, when the great hall lay empty, and the morning light fell thin and gray through the high windows and pooled upon the long table where so many decisions had been weighed. She did not speak of visions, for she had learned the futility of that, but she spoke of patterns, of the way that quiet men who kept their own counsel and paid their debts too promptly often nursed the deepest hungers. And she named Roose Bolton and she named the bastard son that Roose kept and did not keep, the boy called Ramsay, who was already, even now, riding the lands about the Dreadfort with a pack of dogs, and a taste for the hunting of things that ought not to be hunted. Ned listened with the grave stillness that was his nature, and when she had finished, he was silent for a long while, his hands folded upon the scarred oak, his eyes fixed upon some middle distance where old loyalties and older suspicions contended. He had never trusted Roose fully, for no honest man could look into that pale, unblinking gaze and feel warmth, yet neither had he ever caught the Lord of the Dreadfort in any act that honor could condemn, and Ned Stark was a man who would not move against another upon suspicion alone. It was Robb who leaned forward, younger and quicker, and asked how a lord might be tested without giving offense that would drive him toward the very treachery they feared. And in that question, Catelyn heard the sharpening of a mind that had grown, in these strange months, far beyond its years. The test they devised was subtle, a matter of commands and observances, of watching how Roose deployed his men, and to whom he wrote, and how swiftly and how truly he answered the summons of his liege. They set trusted eyes upon the Dreadfort's roads, and they arranged that a portion of the Bolton levies be kept close beneath Stark banners, rather than dispatched to hold some distant post where they might slip their leash. And they moved, gently and without accusation, to draw the matter of Ramsay into the light, for a bastard who had never been legitimized, and who conducted himself as a scourge upon the small folk, was a thing that a Lord Paramount might rightfully take notice of, and Ned Stark took notice, and sent word that the boy's cruelties would be answered under the king's peace, as any man's would be. Roose Bolton felt the tightening of the net, as such a man was bound to feel it, and being who he was, he sought at once to turn constraint into opportunity. He wrote where he ought not to have written, and the roads that no honest messenger would ride were watched by men who owed the Starks their honesty, and a rider was taken, in the frozen dark, carrying a letter sealed with the flayed man of House Bolton, addressed south, promising things that no vassal should ever promise to his liege's enemies. When the letter was laid upon the long table before Robb and Ned and Catelyn, the parchment still cold from the road, the words upon it did not surprise her, for she had known their shape before she had ever known the man who wrote them, yet the confirmation settled in her chest with a heavy finality all the same. There was no long trial, no drawn-out reckoning, for the evidence was plain, and the North had learned to move with purpose. Roose Bolton was summoned to Winterfell under a pretext he could not refuse, and he came, pale and composed, and betraying nothing, until the moment the letter was set before him, and he understood at last that the game he had thought hidden had been visible from the first. What passed in that hall was swift and grim. Roose knelt to hear his crime read aloud before the assembled lords, and Ned took his head himself in the old way, while word came that same night that Ramsay had been dragged from his hounds in chains. House Bolton's threat to the north was ended, its ancient seat given into the keeping of men whose loyalty had been proven rather than assumed, and the boy Ramsay, run to ground before his cruelties could ripen into the horrors they might have become, was denied the future that had once been his to seize. With the eastern threat quieted, Catelyn turned her attention to the danger she knew still slept beneath their own roof, the danger that wore a young man's easy smile and answered to the name of Theon Greyjoy. She remembered the burning, remembered a captured Winterfell and 2 small charred bodies displayed upon the walls, the miller's boys murdered and named as princes to cover a lie, and she would not permit that grief to be borne. And so Winterfell was garrisoned as it had not been garrisoned before, its gates held by men who would not be charmed, and Theon was watched with a quiet, unceasing care that gave him neither the opening nor the temptation to betray the only true home he had ever known. The Greyjoy Rebellion, when its longships turned toward the northern shores, would find no undefended seat to fall upon. Yet even as one shadow was lifted from the north, another moved south along hidden roads, and Catelyn, standing upon the battlements in the pale winter light, felt the game shift beneath her once again. The word came first as rumor, the way all great tidings did, carried by the mouths of sailors who had drunk too deeply in the ports of the free cities and returned home with their tales grown taller in the telling. A silver-haired girl in the Far East, they said, a queen who had walked into fire and emerged unburnt, with 3 living dragons clinging to her shoulders, the last of a house that Westeros had believed dead and buried these many years. Catelyn heard the whispers before the ravens came, and she did not dismiss them as the others did, for she alone in all the north possessed the memory of what those whispers would one day become. She knew the name that lived beneath the rumor, and she knew that the dragons were real, and she knew that the girl who commanded them would one day cross the narrow sea with fire enough to remake the world or to burn it wholly to ash. When the letters at last confirmed what the rumors had only hinted, they came bearing the seal of merchants and spies, and men who traded in secrets, and they told of a Khalasar bent to a woman's will, of cities that had bowed or fallen before her, of a queen who called herself the breaker of chains and gathered to her banner all the broken people of the earth. Ned read these tidings by candlelight in his solar, his brow furrowed, and he spoke of the last Targaryen as one speaks of an old wound, for it was Targaryen madness that had cost him his father and his brother, and the memory of that grief sat heavy upon him still. Yet Catelyn, who sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap, saw the matter differently, for she had lived a life beyond this one and knew that vengeance was a poor foundation upon which to build a future. She is not her father, Catelyn said quietly, and the words surprised him, coming as they did from the woman who had every reason to hate the blood that ran in that distant girl's veins. The Mad King burned your father alive, and I will not pretend that the wound of it has healed. But a daughter is not the sum of her father's crimes, and this girl was born in exile, raised in fear, sold like chattel by a brother who cared nothing for her. What she becomes has not yet been decided, and there may be a way, husband, to see that she becomes something the world can survive. Ned looked at her for a long moment, the candle flame guttering between them, and he asked her what she meant, though some part of him had already begun to guess. She spoke then of Jon, and of the truth that Ned himself had confided, and that they had guarded so carefully within the walls of their family. The truth that the boy Ned had raised as his bastard son carried within him the blood of the very dragons that now stirred in the east. If Daenerys Targaryen was the last daughter of her house, then Jon was its last son, and where once such a revelation might have meant only rival claims and another turning of the wheel of blood, Catelyn saw in it instead a bridge that might be built across the narrow sea, a joining rather than a sundering, a joining of ice and fire, aunt and nephew both, a thing the dragon lords had done for centuries and that the realm might swallow more easily than another war. The debate that followed unfolded over many nights, in the warmth of the solar and the cold of the godswood where Ned went to think, and it drew in Robb, grown thoughtful and steady, and it drew in Jon himself, who listened to talk of his true parentage with the quiet gravity of a young man learning that the shape of his whole life had been other than he believed. He did not want a crown, he said, and Catelyn believed him, for she had seen enough of men who hungered for power to recognize a soul that did not. But wanting was one thing, and duty another, and she counseled him gently that a claim need not be a demand, that blood might be offered as friendship rather than brandished as a threat, and that the last two Targaryens in all the world might do more good standing together than either could do standing alone against the long night she knew was coming. And so the North, which had for generations turned its face inward toward its own snows and its own gods, began quietly to turn its gaze eastward across the sea. Letters were written with great care, each word weighed, sent by trusted hands to men in Pentos and Karth and the cities of Slavers' Bay, who might carry word to the Dragon Queen's ear. They spoke no promises that could not be kept, but they planted a seed, the notion that in the cold and distant north there dwelt a house that did not hate her, a house bound to her by a thread of shared blood that only a few living souls yet knew. Emissaries were chosen and prepared, men who could speak with dignity and hold their tongues, and provisions were made for a journey that would take them into lands the Starks had never known. Catelyn stood upon the battlements once more as the first of those emissaries rode out through the gates of Winterfell, watching the small party dwindle to specks against the white expanse of the winter road, and she felt the weight of what she had set in motion settle upon her shoulders like a mantle of snow. She had changed the shape of things, she knew, had bent the story onto a path it had never walked before, and she could not yet see where that path would lead. Somewhere far to the east, a young queen was gathering her strength, and somewhere far to the south, the Game of Thrones was drawing toward its first great reckoning, and between them, the North had chosen at last to be neither prey nor pawn, but something new. And as the riders vanished from her sight, a raven arrived from the south, bearing tidings that made her heart clench cold within her chest. The tidings spoke of the Wall, of a ranging party that had gone north beyond the shadow of that ancient ice and had not returned, and of a single survivor who had staggered back through the gate raving of shapes in the dark that walked though they should have lain still. Catelyn read the words twice, though she needed only the first passing to understand them, for she carried within her a knowledge that no raven could deepen, a memory that was not quite memory, but rather the residue of some other life in which these very things had unfolded and been ignored until it was too late. She lowered the parchment slowly and stood for a long moment upon the battlements, while the wind pulled at the loose strands of her hair, and she felt the cold not only of the northern air, but of something older and hungrier that lay beyond the edge of the known world, patient as the grave. That night she went to Ned in the solar, where he sat before the fire with the day's cares still upon his brow, and she told him what she believed, with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She did not speak of the strange dreams that had returned her to this place, for such things could not be spoken aloud without inviting doubt, but she spoke of the ranging that had failed and the survivor who raved, and she wove from these threads a warning so urgent that Ned set aside his cup and gave her his full and grave attention. He had always trusted her judgment, had learned over the long years of their marriage that when Catelyn Stark spoke with such certainty, there was reason beneath it. And though the tale she told stretched at the boundaries of what a sensible lord might credit, he did not laugh, and he did not dismiss her. "The others are a story told to frighten children in their cradles," he said, but there was no conviction in the words, only the reflex of a man reaching for the comfort of the familiar. "So were dragons," she answered softly, "until a girl across the narrow sea woke 3 from stone. The world is older and stranger than we have let ourselves remember, and the wall was not raised to keep out wildlings alone. Men built 800 feet of ice against something, Ned. We would be fools to believe they wasted their lives on a fear that had no shape." Jon was summoned in the days that followed, and when he came into the solar with the frost still melting from his cloak, Catelyn looked upon him, not with the old coldness she had carried for so many years, but with something near to reverence, for she saw in him now the shape of the answer to a question the realm had not yet learned to ask. He had grown into a young man of quiet strength, and there clung to him the blood of two ancient houses, the wolf and the dragon both, though only a scattered few yet knew the fullness of what he was. When Ned laid the matter before him, Jon did not flinch from it as another might have, for the wall had called to him since boyhood, and now that call had acquired a weight and a meaning that stirred something deep within his breast. It was Jon who undertook the long and delicate labor of drawing together those who had never before stood as allies. He rode to Castle Black and sat with the brothers of the Watch, whose numbers had dwindled to a shadow of what they once had been, and he spoke to them not as a high-born boy come to lecture broken men, but as one who understood the burden of their vigil. He rode further still, into the haunted forest and the frozen valleys beyond, and there he met with the leaders of the free folk, men and women who had learned across 100 hard winters that something was stirring in the far north, something that drove whole clans southward in terror toward the very wall that had kept them penned for centuries. That Jon carried the blood of the dragon lent his words a strange authority among a people who prized strength and cared nothing for the titles of the South, and that he carried the blood of the Starks won him the ear of the northern lords, who might otherwise have scorned any parley with wildlings. Slowly, against the grain of every old enmity, a fragile understanding began to take shape, and behind it, the North bent itself to a labor that most of Westeros would have thought madness. At Catelyn's insistence, expeditions were sent to Dragonstone and to every place where the black volcanic glass could be found, and wagons began to arrive at Winterfell laden with obsidian, that brittle and beautiful stone which the maesters called dragon glass. Smiths who had spent their lives forging steel were set to the unfamiliar task of napping blades and arrowheads from it, cursing at first at the strangeness of the work, and then falling silent as they came to sense, though they could not have said how, that these weapons might one day matter more than any sword of castle-forged steel. The armories of the North began to fill with a strange and glittering harvest, and the years that Catelyn had bought through her early warning became years of quiet, patient preparation that the realm had never in its first telling been granted. Yet even as the stockpiles grew and the alliance held, there came from the North a fresh dispatch, carried by a rider whose horse had been driven near to death, and when the man was brought before Jon at Castle Black, he could barely speak for the cold and the fear that gripped him. He had been among a second ranging sent to confirm the first, and he had seen with his own eyes what walked in the long dark beyond the wall, and as he opened his cracked lips to tell of it, the torches in the hall seemed to gutter low, and every man who heard him felt the winter press close against the ancient stones. The tidings from beyond the wall might have shattered a lesser realm into panic, yet the North that received them was not the divided and quarrelsome land it had once been. Word of the dead moved southward along the King's Road and outward across the sea, and it reached other ears in other places, and among those who listened most carefully was a queen who had crossed the whole width of the world with 3 dragons and an army gathered from the ashes of slavery. Daenerys Targaryen had heard whispers of the strange happenings in Westeros for years, of a northern king who had risen and held, of a Stark lord who had cheated death, of a boy of black hair and violet blood who commanded loyalty from wildlings and lords alike, and something in these tales had turned her prow at last toward the shores of her ancestors. She came in the gray hour of a winter morning, her ships black against the pale water, and above them the dragons wheeled and cried out with voices that no man living had heard before in that country. Those who watched from the cliffs of the northern coast felt the old fear rise in their throats. For the last time, dragons had darkened these skies, the world had been remade in fire. And yet there was no burning now, only the vast shadows passing over the frost-rimed fields, and the sound of great wings beating against the cold. The queen had come not as a conqueror stepping onto hostile ground, but as one summoned by necessity, and the men who met her upon the shore did not scatter before her, for they had been made ready by years of warning and did not flinch from what they saw. In the first telling of these things, such a meeting had been a poisoned affair from its opening moment, a collision of two proud powers who trusted nothing and no one, where every word had carried the weight of old grievance and every silence had bred suspicion. But the world had bent along a different course, and when Daenerys was brought before the gathered lords of the north, she found among them a man whose face was known to half the realm by reputation, and whose word carried an authority that no crown could purchase. Ned Stark stood gray and weathered, and utterly himself, alive against all the expectations of history, and when the queen looked upon Jon Snow standing at his side, it was Ned who spoke first, and it was Ned whose plain and unadorned honesty broke through the wariness that hung in the air like frost. He told her, in the level voice of a man who had never in his life traded in flattery, that the boy she looked upon was of her own blood, that he had been born of Rhaegar and Lyanna in a tower of red stone in the south, and that he, Eddard Stark, had raised him as his own and had guarded the secret of his birth for the whole of the boy's life. There was no cunning in the telling, no play for advantage, and precisely because of this, the words landed with a force that no schemer's argument could ever have carried. Daenerys, who had spent her life among those who lied to her and used her and sought to bend her to their ends, heard in this weathered lord a thing she had scarcely known, and her guarded eyes moved from the father who had raised the boy to the boy himself, and something in her ancient loneliness stirred and softened. Jon met her gaze without pride and without bending, for he had never sought a crown of his own and did not now grasp for one, and this too she saw and marked. Here at last was another who carried the blood of the dragon, another who had known what it was to stand apart and belong nowhere fully, and the two of them regarded one another across the cold hall as the last of a burned house, kin found at the edge of the world. Yet even kinship might have curdled into rivalry, for a dragon queen and a king in the north were two sovereigns where the realm had need of one, and it was here that Catelyn Stark did the quiet work that no chronicle would ever fully record. She had learned, in a life lived once already, and now lived again with terrible foreknowledge, exactly how such pride could sour, and how such suspicion could fester into ruin, and she moved between the two of them with a patience that seemed to those watching almost like tenderness. She spoke to the queen of Jon's steadiness and of the loyalty he inspired, and she spoke to Jon of the queen's suffering and of the strength she had wrested from it, and where each was inclined to see a threat she taught them, gently and without ever seeming to instruct, to see instead an ally. The woman who had once looked upon Jon Snow with cold resentment now stood as the bridge upon which his fortune and the fortune of the realm would cross, and she did it not for herself, but for the living, all of them, north and south alike. By the time the great hall had emptied and the torches burned low, an accord had been struck that the seven kingdoms had not seen the equal of in living memory. The dragons of House Targaryen, the the massed armies of the north, the wild peoples who had come down from beyond the wall, and the banners of the great houses who had bound themselves to the Stark cause, all stood now beneath a single purpose. First, to unmake the boy king, who festered upon the Iron Throne, and then to turn as one against the enemy that gathered in the dark. It was the strongest force the realm had assembled in generations, and yet even as the maps were unrolled and the strategies debated deep into the night, another rider was already spurring hard along the frozen road, bearing tidings that would test the newborn alliance before it had drawn its first full breath. The rider came with frost upon his lashes and a horse near foundering beneath him, and the tidings he carried were the ones that every soul north of the neck had dreaded, even as they had prepared for them. The dead were moving. The wall, that vast and ancient bulwark of ice and old magic, had held for 8,000 years against every horror the far north could muster, and now the horns of the Night's Watch sounded 3 long blasts, and word of them raced south to settle into the bones of every man and woman who heard it, and settled into the bones of every man and woman who heard them. Yet where in another turning of the world such a sound would have brought only despair and a scramble of unready men toward a slaughter they could not comprehend, here it found a realm already coiled and waiting, its armies mustered, its stores laid deep, its leaders gathered and of one mind. Catelyn stood upon the battlements of Winterfell when the word reached her, and she felt the cold of it not in her heart, but in the memory that lived beneath her heart, that second knowledge she had carried across the threshold of death. She had seen this before, or rather she had seen the shape of what came after it, the burning villages and the shattered hosts, and the long defeats that had bled the living white before any true stand could be made. She had known, in that other life, only the aftermath, the grief and the ruin, the great houses reduced to fragments quarreling over ashes. Now she knew what must be done to spare the realm that fate, and she had spent long months ensuring that the knowledge would not die unspoken within her. The dragonglass had been mined and shaped and carried out in wagons by the thousandfold, for she had pressed upon Ned and upon the maesters the urgency of it long before any dragon had crossed the narrow sea. And now every soldier who marched north bore a blade or a spearhead of the black volcanic glass that the dead could not abide. It was a small thing, a matter of foresight and stubborn insistence in the face of men who had thought her half mad. And yet it was the difference between a host that could strike and a host that could only die. She had learned that lesson at a cost no living soul could measure, and she had spent it freely. Jon rode at the head of the vanguard as the armies moved to meet the enemy upon the field, and there was in him now a quality that no herald or maester could have manufactured, a thing that the men saw and followed without being told to follow. He was stark in his bearing, and in the grave northern patience of him, raised in the halls of Winterfell, and shaped by the cold honor of the man he still called father, and he was Targaryen in his blood, in the fire that answered to him when the great beasts wheeled overhead. The living looked upon him and saw not a bastard nor a pretender, but a bridge between the old powers of the realm, a man who belonged to both the ice and the flame, and in a war that would be won or lost upon the willingness of frightened people to stand fast together, that symbol was worth more than a legion. When the dead came, they came as a tide of pale limbs and blue-lit eyes across the snow, and the sound of them was no sound at all, but a terrible silence, broken only by the shuffle of frozen feet and the groan of ice. Yet the living did not break. Daenerys brought her dragons down in sheets of fire that turned the whites to falling embers, and where the flames could not reach, the ranks of dragonglass spears held the line, and behind them the archers loosed volley upon volley of black-tipped shafts. Catelyn had labored with the commanders over the maps in the long nights before, warned them of what the dead had done to the north in her own lifetime, the raised corpses and the cold that came before them, all she had glimpsed in the years before the river took her. And so the marshals held their reserves where the blow would fall, rather than where it seemed it might, and the flanks did not crumple, and the field did not become the massacre it had been in the world only she remembered. The battle was terrible even so, for no foreknowledge could make war anything but blood and terror, and the screaming of the wounded in the dark. Men died beneath that starless sky, good men who had marched from every corner of the realm, and the snow drank deep of them. Yet they died in their hundreds where they might have died in their tens of thousands, and they did not die in vain, for the line held and the dragons burned, and the great enemy that had gathered against all life was met not by a broken and scattered remnant, but by the united strength of a realm that had been given the gift of preparation. And when at last the tide turned, when the horde of the dead began to falter and thin and fall before the fire and the black glass, it was not by some single desperate stroke of fortune that the living prevailed, not by one lone hero flinging himself into the dark to strike a blow that no plan had foreseen. It was won as Catelyn had prayed it would be won, by strategy and coordination, and the patient application of everything she had labored to put in place, by Stark and Targaryen fighting as one beneath a single banner. Ned Stark yet lived to command the northern host, and Robb rode at the head of the horse, and the survival of these men meant that the victory, when it came, would not leave a hollow realm to fracture and bleed anew. But the enemy was not yet broken, and even as the first gray light crept across the field of the dead, a fresh horn sounded from the eastern ridge, low and long and full of dread. That horn from the eastern ridge marked not a new terror, but the last exhaustion of the old one, for the host that answered it was not fresh at all, but the final remnant of the fallen legions, driven forward by a will already fracturing, and against the ordered lines of living men who had drilled for this hour through a season of preparation. That last surge broke against the ordered lines, and there upon the ridge the fell thing that commanded the dead was ringed at last by dragonfire and dragonglass, and when it shattered the whole host it had raised fell dead with it. When the light came fully across the field, it fell upon no army of the dead, but upon melting drifts and scattered bone, and the quiet of men too weary to cheer, and the war of the long night was over, and the living had kept the world. What followed in the wide realm below was gentler than any of them had dared to hope, for the war had rearranged the pieces of the great game before the game could resume its old cruelties. The Lannister claim, propped so long upon secrets and gold and the careful management of appearances, had no ground left to stand upon once the truth of Jon's birth was spoken plainly by those who could no longer be silenced, and the lords who had once bent their knees to lions found that the lions had become, in the telling and the retelling, a small and tarnished thing beside the memory of dragons riding north to save them all. There was no long war of succession, no years of siege and starvation and burned villages, for the exhausted realm had no appetite for it, and the negotiated peace that emerged placed Daenerys upon the throne with Jon beside her, their union binding fire to ice as surely as any oath, and the North was granted the autonomy it had bled for, ruled by its own king, beneath a crown that answered to no southern master. Ned Stark lived to see his son Robb take up that crown, lived to walk the halls of Winterfell as an old man with grandchildren at his knee, and this alone would have been miracle enough to justify all the strange grace that had been given. Catelyn grew old, in a world that should not have existed, and she knew it, and she carried the knowing quietly. She had come back once into a body already living, into a life she had ruined the first time through, and she had spent that second passage laboring against the future she alone remembered. And now, the future had come, and it did not match her memory at any point that mattered. Robb ruled, and did not lie cold beneath a river with a wolf's head sewn to his shoulders. Sansa had not been broken upon the wheels of southern courts, but had grown into a woman of quiet strength, who moved between the realms as an envoy of peace. Arya had not vanished into years of wandering and killing, but had come home wilder and freer than any daughter of a great house had a right to be, and she laughed still, which Catelyn had feared she might never do again. Bran walked, having been caught before he ever fell, and Rickon had grown tall and unafraid, and there were no ghosts among them, no empty chairs, no names spoken only in grief. In her final years, Catelyn held a place that no woman of Winterfell had held before her, for the peace itself had made her something more than a lady of a castle. She sat upon the council that governed the reforged realm, honored openly as the architect of the survival that had been won. Her counsel sought by kings and queens who had learned to trust the strange clarity of her judgment. Her name, spoken with a reverence that had nothing to do with marriage or birth, and everything to do with what she had built. She had stepped beyond the walls that had once contained her, beyond the narrow role of wife and mother and mourner, and become a guardian of the peace in her own right, and she carried that new weight with a grace that surprised even herself. Yet one thing remained undone, one debt she had never repaid, and in the last autumn of her life, she called Jon to her in the quiet solar, where the light came thin and gold through the narrow window, and she told him the truth she had carried alone. She told him of the first life, of the fever that had taken Bran, and the vow she had made in her grief, of the cruelty she had shown a motherless boy who had done nothing to earn it, of the words she had spoken to him in that other, ruined world, words she had never been able to unsay, because in that world there had been no time, and then no chance, and then no life at all. She told him she had come back knowing she was wrong, and that everything she had done since had been, in some measure, an atonement he had never known he was owed. Jon listened, and the fire crackled, and when she had finished, he did not speak for a long while. Then he took her old hand in his, the hand that had once shut a door against him, and he told her that he forgave her, and that he had forgiven her long ago, before he had ever known there was anything to forgive, because the mother she had become in this life had left no room in him for the memory of any other. In that forgiveness, something in Catelyn came finally to rest, some old and buried thing that had driven her across two lives, and she understood at last that she had not merely saved her family from death, but had remade herself into someone worthy of the second chance she had been granted. She died in her sleep in the deep of a northern winter, surrounded by children who lived, in a castle that stood, in a realm at peace, and the world she left behind was gentler and truer than the one she had first been given, and it would remember her, not for her sorrows, but for what her love had built. And that was a good and quiet ending, and it was enough. And this brings us to the end of this alternate history. If you enjoyed exploring how events might have unfolded differently, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. We dive into new stories from the world of Westeros every single day, imagining the choices, battles, alliances, and destinies that could have completely changed the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. And if you'd like to explore even more stories, our Lorekeeper members unlock a brand new exclusive alternate history every single week. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What do you think would have happened next? Did this version of history end better than the original? Or would you have taken the story in a completely different direction? Leave your ideas in the comments, because many of the best future stories come directly from your suggestions. Thank you so much for watching and for spending your time with me. I'll see you tomorrow with another alternate history from Westeros. Until then, peace out.